Hello and thanks for watching. In this video, I'm going to take you on a tour through some Jewish writings, sometimes called the pseudepigrapha, sometimes referring to the time period in which they were written, Second Temple texts. A lot of these texts that we're going to look at today will fall into one of those two categories. When people are doing source criticism on the Quran and on other Islamic texts, I think the tendency sometimes is to try to stay within roughly that time frame. And so a lot of scholars will look at, for example, Surah 18 and Surah 19 of the Quran, and they'll see parallels there where the author has adapted the material from other sources that are roughly contemporary. However, I'm going to take you back a couple of hundred years into some Jewish literature where we find some striking parallels to the Hadith and to the Quran as well. Now, it's appropriate to do this because though these texts, some of them at least, predate Muhammad's time by several hundred years, the ideas that we're going to see in these texts are extremely significant and have left quite a mark throughout the history of Jewish thought. And these ideas were still relevant in Muhammad's day and even beyond. And we'll be able to see more places where Muhammad has simply adapted what he heard. They're floating around in 7th century Arabia into his worldview. Muhammad was the first copy-paste Muslim, and we're going to see how that works out here in this video. So in the first place, why is it okay to look at Jewish sources to see where Muhammad adapted some of his material from, given the legacy of Islamic anti-Semitism? I mean, Muhammad in his career became a Jew hater, so it seems rather paradoxical that we would want to look at Jewish writings to see where Muhammad got his material. It's one of the paradoxes of Islam, but it is appropriate by the testimony of the Hadith and the Quran itself. So let's look at a couple of examples. We'll start with Sunan Anasai. This is where a Jew comes to Muhammad and says, "You are setting up rivals to Allah by associating others with him." So Muhammad was swearing by the Kaaba. The Jew says, "Don't do that." And Muhammad then corrects his worldview based on this information from this Jew and commands his followers to say, "By the Lord of the Kaaba," right down here. So Muhammad takes this information from this particular Jew and uses it to correct his own worldview. There's another example. And this is the account where there's a Jewish woman who's talking to Aisha, and Muhammad is apparently there on the scene as well. And the Jew tells Aisha, the Jewish woman, nonetheless, tells Aisha that she'll be tortured in the grave. Muhammad doesn't respond very well to this. He says, rather, the Jews will be tested. So Muhammad is apparently offended by what this Jewish woman says and says, no, that's just for the Jews. Then Aisha said, a few nights later, the messenger of Allah said, "It has been revealed to me that you will be tested in your grave." So he comes back a couple of days later. That Jewish woman, she was actually right. And so Muhammad freely, then after a couple of days of getting over this, the abrasiveness of the thought of being tested in the grave or tortured in the grave, admits that the Jewish woman is correct. So Muhammad's theology is corrected by this Jewish woman. From the Quran in Surah 5, we ordained for the children of Israel that if anyone slew a person, unless it be for murder or for spreading mischief in the land, it would be as if he slew the whole people. And if anyone saved a life, it would be as if he saved the life of the whole people. Then we come down here to the Mishnah. Whoever destroys a single Israelite soul is deemed by Scripture as if he destroyed the whole world. And whoever saves a single soul, and then again, very similar language to the Quran there about saving the whole world between the Mishnah and Surah 5. Now, the similarities are magnified when we go back and look at the context. What's the context in the Quran in Surah 5? Well, the context, if you back up a couple of ayat from 27 and 30 in Surah 5, recite to them the truth of the story of the two sons of Adam, and then refers to the murder of his brother. So you have the story of Cain and Abel. That's the context there in Surah 5. Well, guess what the context is for the related passage in the Mishnah? It's the same thing. We back up a bit in the Mishnah, for so we find in the case of Cain who slew his brother. So the context is the same, and then we get to those two related passages about a man who kills someone. It's as if he killed the whole world, and then if you save a life, it's as if you save the whole world. So the context is the same, and the language is very similar. So we see from the Quran and the Hadith both that they testify to the Jewish influence in Muhammad's worldview. Now, of course, we expect to find this in the Quran as well, given that Muhammad was influenced by the Jews, because the Quran, contrary to what Muslims want to claim, is actually the word of Muhammad by the testimony of the Quran itself. Surah 81, verily this is the word of a most honorable messenger. Muslims seem to forget about that ayah when they're quoting from the Quran as the word of Allah. So that's a little bit about why it's appropriate to look at Jewish texts to see the origin of Muhammad's ideas. And we're going to look at 3 examples now, because I just want to show how having some of these texts floating around in your head from these Jewish sources will change the way that you read the Islamic text. So let's jump into these 3 examples. All right, we'll start with an intro to the book of Colossians. Scholars have gone back in time and tried to figure out what Paul exactly was writing against. There was a heresy there that Paul was addressing. So this excerpt is taken from an introduction to that book. The ideas of Merkabah mystics provide some interesting parallels to Colossian heresy. Now, you're going to see this term pop up a couple of times during this video, Merkabah mysticism. Merkabah mysticism was a major thought, or a couple of schools of thought, in the history of Jewish theology. And when you hear Merkabah mysticism throughout this video, you need to have a couple of things floating around in your head. And one of them would be visits to heaven, okay? Ascents into heaven, spiritual journeys into heaven, that type of thing. The other thing you need to have in mind is the synchronization of events between heaven and earth. Okay, that's another prominent belief that was in Merkabah mysticism, and we're going to see how some of this plays into Islamic texts. Now, we won't go through Merkabah mysticism texts per se, but we'll look at ideas that are in Jewish texts that go right along with this belief system. It's a pretty interesting project if any of you are into that type of thing. But anyway, the ideas of Merkabah mystics provide some interesting parallels to the Colossian heresy. The heretics stressed the role of angels as mediators between God and man, and visions played an important part in their religious life. So this is just a vague sort of example here, just to get things going, right? Merkabah mysticism has a lot to do with angels, with angelic mediation and so forth. And when you think about that, and then you think about Islam, how Jibreel is the one who Muhammad first saw, allegedly, in the cave. He appeared to Muhammad. And then the Quran, the most important book in the Islamic worldview, was revealed, every single ayah, by Jibreel. Without Jibreel, there's no Quran that's revealed. Suddenly God, whose word came directly to prophets in the Old Testament, now has a filter. Angels have an increased importance in Islamic ideology. And so this isn't a direct connection, but if you have some of this stuff floating around your head, you kind of get the impression that you've heard this before. Okay, let's move on to another example. From Bukhari, I asked the Prophet, which deed is dearest to Allah? And he replied, to offer prayers at their early stated fixed times. Offering prayers at fixed times. You get less rewards. If you miss a prayer, you get more rewards for offering your prayers on time. And of course, in Sahih al-Bukhari, in the book of the time of prayers, is where you can find this, beginning at Hadith 520, 521, something along those lines. So again, Merkabah mysticism has a lot to do with the synchronization between events like worship between heaven and earth. Okay, the calendar is a divinely appointed system by God. And you run into this stuff in books like Jubilees. And no one shall corrupt its appointed time. But if they are transgressed, those appointed times, and they do not observe them according to his commandment, then they will corrupt all of their fixed times. So when you run into hadith where Muhammad's talking about specific times for things, you have to pray at this time or that time, once again, if you have this stuff floating around in your head, you realize that there might be some reason Muhammad thought this, because he was influenced by other major elements in Jewish theology. Let's get a little bit more specific now. How many holy places are there in Islam? Well, of course, there are 3. With the help of Kathir's tafsir, we get 2. Glorified be he who took his servant for a journey by night from Masjid al-Haram to Masjid al-Aqsa. Okay, so from Mecca up to al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. So there are 2, and then the third one from Sahih Muslim, and as he came close to Medina, he said, O Allah, I declare Medina sacred as well. So you have 3 holy places in Islam. How many holy places do you think the Jews had? 3. Yeah, good job. From Jubilees, we have the Garden of Eden, Mount Sinai, and Mount Zion. The 3 of these were created as holy places. So the Jews had their 3 holy places. Muhammad had to have his 3 holy places as well. Now let's get into some specifics. We'll start with 7 heavens. The cosmology of 7 heavens is fundamental to the Merkabah texts. The descriptions of the contents of the 7 heavens is also a standard Merkabah motif. So there's that phrase again, or the word Merkabah, thinking about Merkabah mysticism. So 7 heavens. Let's look at a couple of examples from 2nd Enoch. And those men lifted me up from there. This is Enoch's journey into heaven. And they carried me up to the 7th heaven. Interesting. From 3 Enoch, again, 7 heavens. From the Talmud, we have 7 firmaments of heaven once again, and the 7 firmaments of heaven and the 6 corresponding to the airspace between them. Lots of talk about 7 heavens in Jewish literature. From Surah 2, no surprise, we have 7 heavens. Surah 17, we have 7 heavens. Surah 23, we have 7 heavens. And of course, from the Hadith as well, glory is to Allah, the Lord of the 7 heavens. Now, given that 7 heavens was a very prominent component of Jewish cosmology, it's no surprise that we see it showing up in the Islamic texts as well. What about Muhammad's night flight? The idea of 7 steps of ascent to the divinity, which correspond to the 7 heavens, is widely known. So let's compare Muhammad's divine ascent with some that we see in Jewish texts. Baruch is one of a number of books concerning the visions of a man conducted through the various heavens. We have the Testament of Abraham, Apocalypse of Abraham, 1 Enoch, 2 Enoch, the Testament of Levi, and the Vision of Isaiah, and the Merkabah literature. These list 7 heavens, and their contents are also given in rabbinic sources. So 7 heavens as well as ascents into heaven, nothing new in Jewish literature. I had to mention this as well from Sahih Muslim. Muslims like to use the argument from sound with the Song of Solomon, right? There's a word, a Hebrew word in Song of Solomon 5:16 that sounds like Muhammad, therefore it must be Muhammad. Well, the next time they use that, you can go to Sahih Muslim and you can look at the animal, the name of the animal that Muhammad rode, Al-Barak, right? Al-Barak. Well, Al-Barak sounds a lot like Baruch, which is a Jewish text that describes an ascent into heaven. So it seems like Muhammad got the name, if you want to use the argument from sound, of his horse-like animal from Jewish texts that also contain similar accounts to Muhammad's of ascents into heaven. So back to Enoch and heavenly ascents. Winds in the vision caused me to fly and lifted me upward and bore me into heaven. From the Apocalypse of Abraham, behold, the expanses under me, the heavens opened, and I saw on the 7th firmament upon which I stood. From the ascension of Isaiah, and he took me up into the 7th heaven, and I saw one standing there whose glory surpassed that of all. Then, of course, from Sahih Muslim, then we traveled on to the 7th heaven. So there are a lot of very influential Jewish writings that contain accounts of people traveling up through the 7 heavens, and so Muhammad had to make sure that he got his heavenly journey as well. Let's move on to the topic of eternal tablets. The concept of heavenly books is also well documented in later extra-biblical Jewish literature. A similar heavenly book containing the deeds of individuals as a record for divine judgment is found in the Persian religion of Zoroaster. There are, of course, numerous parallels to Zoroastrianism, to Persian writings as well in the Islamic texts, but we'll stick to the Jewish texts for now. The vision of heaven was shown to me, and from the words of the watchers and the holy ones I have learned everything, and in the heavenly tablets I read everything, and I understood. Once again, from Enoch I have read the tablets of heaven, and have seen the holy writings, and I have understood them. From Jubilees 5, and the judgment of all of them has been ordained and written in the heavenly tablets without injustice. Once again from Jubilees, the appointed times are written and inscribed for an eternal witness. And one more from Jubilees 6, thus it is engraved and ordained on the heavenly tablets. So it should come as no surprise then that the Quran is inscribed in the preserved tablet, and from Bukhari we find that Allah has his heavenly books as well. Let's talk about the binding of evil spirits. This is a popular theme in Jewish apocalyptic hope. Let's look at some texts. We'll start in Enoch 10. And again the Lord said to Raphael, bind Azazel hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness. And once again from Enoch, and there my eyes saw them making their instruments iron chains of immeasurable weight. And he said to me, these are being prepared for the host of Azazel, that they might take them and throw them into the abyss of complete judgment. Once again from Enoch, and those who led astray the world will be bound in chains. And from the Testament of Levi, and Beliar shall be bound by him. From Jubilees, and the Lord our God spoke to us so that we might bind all of them, referring to evil spirits. This is from the Testament of Solomon. So there's this little boy, and he went and spoke to Solomon, King Solomon, I brought the demon to you just as you commanded me. Observe how he is standing bound in front of the gates outside. Now catch this hadith. The prophet once offered the prayer and said, Satan came in front of me and tried to interrupt my prayer, but Allah gave me an upper hand on him, and I choked him. No doubt I thought of tying him to one of the pillars of the mosque. Okay, so Muhammad, he could have, if he wanted to, he could have bound Satan to one of the pillars of the mosque, but he decided not to. He could have, but he didn't want to. And he decided not to because, catch this, then I remembered the statement of the prophet Solomon. Did you catch what I read from prior to this? Look, the Testament of Solomon. King Solomon, I brought the demon to you just as you commanded me. Observe how he is standing bound in front of the gates outside. So in the Testament of Solomon, a demon is bound. And in the hadith here, Muhammad could have bound Satan. He could have. But he just decided not to because of something that Solomon said. So given that the binding of Satan and the binding of evil spirits is such a common theme in Jewish literature, Muhammad had to know this. And not to be outdone, he could bind Satan too. But he just decided not to. Let's look at a summary of what we've covered in this video. Sahih narrations themselves attest that Muhammad's worldview was informed by the Jews. Surah 532 draws directly from the Mishnah. In Islam, certain times are divinely ordained. Divinely ordained times and seasons are well attested in earlier Jewish literature. Islam has 3 holy places, the same as Judaism. Angelic roles play a major part of Merkabah Mysticism and in the origin of Islam as well. The 7 heavens in Islamic literature is well attested in earlier Jewish literature. Muhammad's heavenly journey is similar to accounts that are well attested in earlier Jewish texts. Heavenly tablets are well attested in earlier Jewish literature as well, and the binding of evil spirits is well attested in earlier Jewish literature. Now, no Muslim would take any of the Jewish texts we've reviewed in this video as being authoritative. None of them. In fact, the vast majority of Muslims watching this video will never have heard of any of the Jewish texts that I've cited in this video. And you can watch the comments. The comments will bear that out. Muslims will have no idea how to respond. All you're going to see copy-paste polemics. And Muslims are going to be hitting Google with questions like, what is the Testament of Levi? They'll have no idea how to respond. But Muslims need to know what their prophet did. And all he did was just grab various components of other worldviews that were floating around in his day there in 7th century Arabia. He smushed them all together and created a big Islam sandwich, and Muslims have been eating it ever since. Thanks for watching.